Good afternoon. Welcome to Grace and Gavel, where truth meets compassion. My name is Buffy, and I am an 18-year criminal defense attorney who has practiced criminal law for 18 years, obviously, and I will be providing the legal analysis. Today, we're doing something a little differently. We're actually going to go into more about Scott Peterson. For those of you that know, you know that Scott Peterson was initially charged with the death penalty and was put on death row. However, that actually was appealed and he now has life in prison. And I also want to do another side note for all of you who have been participating and interacting on my YouTube community page. Thank you very much. I mean, I really appreciate it. And a lot of the questions that you all have asked have shaped these two podcasts that I'm doing. I'm doing the Scott Peterson, how he escaped the death penalty without escaping his conviction. And then I'm also doing a deep dive into Evelyn Hernandez because I think that her case is as worthy as anyone's of being discussed. And the fact that she was ignored and marginalized, including the fact that her missing, I believe, 5-year-old son as well was involved in that case as well, is just extremely heartbreaking. So right now we're working on Scott Peterson, how he escaped the death penalty without escaping his conviction. When people hear that Scott Peterson escaped the death penalty, they assume the court questioned his guilt. It didn't. This episode is not about innocence, it's about process. And more specifically, it's about what the Constitution requires when the state asks to take a life. And ultimately, as we all would probably agree, if we're not thinking in a vacuum, that should be a high bar. That should not be something that is automatically granted because we have due process rights, right? The right to have a fair trial. We have the right to confront our accusers. We have a lot of rights that the state or the government can't just take away from us. And that is the beauty of our Constitution. Because in 2020, California's highest court overturned Scott Peterson's death sentence while leaving his murder conviction fully intact. And if that sounds confusing, you're not alone. So today we're going to break down exactly what happened, what legal grounds allowed this, and what evidence the appellate court relied on, and why this case still matters even decades later. The conviction versus the sentence, the most important distinction. One of the biggest misunderstandings in criminal law is the idea that a conviction and the sentence are the same thing. They're not. They're actually two separate phases. So essentially, you have your criminal trial in which evidence is put on, testimony is given, probably experts. Generally, those cases, especially high-stakes cases involving a murder, are going to have the best experts, and it's going to be a battle of the experts. And the jury is ultimately going to listen intently, or we hope they do, and that they take their responsibility seriously. And they are going to determine who they believe. And then they're taking notes and all those other things. Then they are going to deliberate, which means they're going to go back and they're going to discuss with each other. The foreperson is essentially the leader of the jury. And so they all are going to determine what they feel like the verdict should be. And from there, if there's a guilty verdict, then the next phase is the sentencing phase. And with the sentencing phase, the defense attorney can put on evidence such as mitigators, meaning, was this person abused? Does this person have mental illness? What sort of things can prevent us from handing down certain aspects of a sentence? And what are aggravators? For instance, you want the circumstances of the crime. How many people were harmed? Likely in the Laci Peterson case, there was a mention about the fact that she was pregnant, that there was a child involved, a fetus involved. And so that would also be potentially an aggravator. There's like mitigators, for instance, like this person confessed, or things like that as an example. So there are two separate phases. And so a sentence answers a different question. What punishment may the state lawfully impose? And at the time, after the initial part of him being found guilty, it was found that the death penalty should have been imposed. In Scott Peterson's case, his conviction for murder was upheld, but his death sentence was overturned. The distinction is not semantic, it's huge, because he goes from spending life on death row to a life in prison. And a life in prison is life in prison. But it's a foundation. It's not semantic, it's foundational. The California Supreme Court did not say the jury got the facts wrong, meaning they're not releasing him. It did not say the evidence was weak. It did not say Peterson deserved a new trial on guilt. Instead, the court focused on constitutional error during jury selection, which is why jury selection is extremely important. Because ultimately, as a criminal defense attorney, you want to get people who you think will listen to what your client has to say. You don't want people who are vigilantes or have a secret motive. There's oftentimes concern that certain people are gunning to be on the jury for whatever reason, maybe notoriety, maybe thinking that they're going to get a book deal, something along those lines. So you have to be very careful and trust your intuition and ask the right questions to a jury. Also, there's this idea of jury nullification, and I think we've gone over that before, in which a jury hears the evidence and decides not to do it. I believe that was used in the O.J. Simpson case, just because given the hotbed environment that was present in LA during that time. And specifically during the penalty phase of the trial, that was just it was a very big error is what they were thinking. So what the appellate court was actually reviewing, the appellate courts do not retry cases because ultimately the trial court is the original trier of fact. And how can you go back and revise what a judge who has heard the evidence, who has listened to the witnesses, has determined to be admissible versus non-admissible? And you can't have another trial just so the appellate courts can listen to what was said. And that's not their role anyway. They're a review. We are a system of checks and balances. One branch can check the other and vice versa. And that's why courts are set up the way that they are set up, to try to catch any errors before they become larger errors. So they do not reweigh the evidence. They do not reassess witness credibility. And how would they reassess witness credibility, right? Because they're not there. The witnesses are long since gone, especially in this case. This case is pretty old. And they cannot substitute their own judgment for the jury. The jury is the ultimate trier of fact. The judge is making sure that things are done within the legal rules and procedures. That is his or her job or their lane. Their role is narrower and stricter. They ask, was the trial conducted in a way that complied with constitutional law? Because the Constitution guides everything. In death penalty cases, the scrutiny is at its highest. Scrutiny means how things are looked, how things are done, if they're done correctly. And it's extremely important, especially when you're trying to take someone's life for a crime, that you do everything by the book and you do things appropriately. Because when the punishment is irreversible, the margin for error must be minimal. And ultimately, unfortunately, we've had cases where we failed. And that's the sad truth. I mean, we are not going to be 100% because we're human. And that's not an excuse. That's just the reality. And I think it's extremely sad that there have been people who have been convicted wrongfully and then pay the ultimate price. So, death qualification of jurors. When prosecutors seek the death penalty, jurors undergo a process called death qualification. Jurors may be excluded only if they are categorically unwilling to consider the death penalty under any circumstance. Jurors may not be excluded simply because they have moral hesitation, express discomfort, or want to weigh mitigating evidence carefully. All of those things are human. All of those things are reasonable. No one wants to say, oh yeah, I want to kill all these people. Absolutely not. And wanting to weigh mitigating or helpful circumstances that could potentially keep them from entering the death penalty, that is definitely their job. In Scott Peterson's trial, the California Supreme Court found that the prospective jurors were dismissed too aggressively. And so it almost makes you wonder if maybe the prosecution was so bent on the death penalty that they were trying to ensure that they would get the death penalty with certainty. And there are prosecutors who are very, very, I guess, justice-oriented, you want to say, maybe overzealous about certain aspects of the job in some ways. And so they do want harsher penalties. And maybe they, you never know what the motive might be. Maybe the motive is they really are into justice. They really are into victims' rights. Or maybe they're trying to, have themselves rise to the top to potentially go for office or something of some kind. And then follow-up questioning was insufficient. Because ultimately, you have to be really careful how you fashion and question jurors, potential jurors. You have to do it in a very level, even way. You don't want to suggest an answer to a juror. You don't want to talk them out of, for instance, if somebody says, you know what, under no circumstances am I going to go along with the death penalty. Then you don't need to say, okay, well, what if it was your mom that had been murdered? Like, would you potentially change your mind on whether or not you would do the death penalty? I mean, you can't try to lead the jury or the juror who's answering the questions down the path that you want them to take because you like the juror or you think that the juror would be beneficial for your client, the prosecution. The process favored jurors more inclined to imposing death. And that's where I thought this was going, because ultimately that is something that the jurors should come on their own. Come by on their own. Not be influenced by a prosecutor or anyone else in the process, the judge or whoever. And that matters, because ultimately it was kind of like a punitive effect. And they were setting out to give the death penalty. Because a jury skewed toward death is more conviction prone, less receptive to mitigation. So even if there were mitigating factors, they would have potentially ignored those because they knew the course that they wanted to take. And constitutionally unreliable in capital sentencing. We all want to have a fair shake at whether or not we're going to get the death penalty or whether we're going to get life in prison. I mean, ultimately, they're both going to have the same result. However, the death penalty is much more violent and has other factors involved as well. So this involves the Sixth Amendment right to an impartial jury. If a jury was already slated to provide the death penalty, that makes it unconstitutional. And it makes it extremely, it makes it completely opposite of what Scott Peterson was entitled to. He was entitled to a fair, impartial jury. So therefore, the sentencing phase was unfair to him, as well as the 14th Amendment guarantee of due process. So why this error invalidated only the death sentence? Here's where many people get really frustrated. If the jury was improperly selected, why wasn't the whole case thrown out? Because the guilt phase and the penalty phase are legally distinct. Because without Scott Peterson being found guilty, the penalty phase would never have happened. But it was only, there's nothing from what I'm seeing here that says that the trial was found to be on the wrong side. It was just the death penalty. The guilt phase in Peterson's trial was lawfully seated. The penalty phase was not lawfully seated. So the remedy had to match the error. It couldn't say, oh, he's innocent because this happened. That would not be an appropriate remedy. The appellate court ruled that the conviction stood, but the death sentence cannot stand. That is not leniency. That is surgical constitutional correction. What evidence the court used and what it did not. The appellate court relied on voir dire transcripts, which are ultimately the conversation between the defense attorneys and the prosecution attorneys and what was said. I'm sure if there were actually tapes and they wanted to hear how things were said, meaning the context and the inflection of the voice and such, that would probably be available. They also looked at juror questionnaires, the trial court rulings on juror exclusions. It did not consider new forensic evidence, alternate suspects, media theories, claims of innocence. This was a process review, not a factual retrial. What would likely get a retrial would be evidence of juror misconduct, witness tampering, anything of that sort. That would potentially get a retrial. But this jury issue, they remedied it by taking away the thing that the prosecution potentially was trying to manipulate, or what they felt maybe that the prosecution was trying to manipulate. Paper law, transcript law, and constitutional law, right? All those things together. The outcome and what escaped actually means. In 2020, Scott Peterson's death sentence was overturned. In 2021, he was resentenced to life without the possibility of parole. That sentence means he will never be released. He will die in prison. Execution is removed from the equation entirely. So when we say he escaped the death penalty, we mean he escaped an unconstitutional sentence. Not accountability, not incarceration, not responsibility. Why this case still matters? This case matters because constitutional protections are tested in the hardest cases. If courts cut corners for defendants we despise, they weaken protections for defendants we sympathize with. And you know, I've done a lot of these cases. One of them comes to mind, Darlie Routier. I think about her a lot. The rule of law must survive public outrage, or it doesn't survive at all. You can believe Scott Peterson is guilty and believe the death penalty was imposed unlawfully. You can believe he was innocent and that this crime and this case should never have gone as far as it did. Both of them are fine. Everyone has their opinion, and that's okay. Those positions are not contradictory. They are law. Justice is not about how angry a case makes us. It's about whether the state followed its own rules and the Constitution. And in this case, when it came to the death penalty, it didn't. Scott Peterson didn't escape prison. He escaped an unconstitutional death sentence. Here's what the court actually ruled and why, and we've talked about that. If you want legal clarity, not headlines, subscribe, share, and join the conversation. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great holiday. Bye-bye.